on Twitter the other day, like someone was like, people are always hassling me. They're like, well, what about all the fires that happen with electric vehicles? And I finally looked up the stats. For every 100,000 vehicles sold with gasoline internal combustion engine vehicles, there's 1,530 fires. So 1,530 fires per 100,000 gas vehicles sold. With electric vehicles, it's 25.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Clean Techies, the podcast. This is episode 41, and today we are speaking with Zach Lefevre, the CEO and founder of ChargeLabs. ChargeLabs is an EV charging company that is primarily a software that helps manage EV charging in an efficient way. Oftentimes can help avoid large surcharges for breaking the energy thresholds during peak demand. It also helps even out the pull on the system when you have multiple cars charging. So a really interesting kind of software play in the EV space. And they are also a marketplace for EV charging equipment. So kind of a one-stop shop to get a lot of different things in the EV infrastructure and charging space handled. Really, really interesting conversation, to be honest. If I'm being frank, I think this is one of my favorite episodes to date, as I felt that Zach and I shared some very interesting kind of similar ideas on the space. Zach in particular was able to share some very interesting insights about some of the topics that we do usually cover, again, from regulation to EV adoption to the future of EV charging. And I think towards the end, my favorite, as usual, the education topic about how we are essentially forming the future generation of workers in this space. So really interesting conversation. Super excited to bring this to you. Before we do get into the show, of course, want to make mention to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave Partners are experts in talent acquisition and recruitment across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you are looking to make a change in your career, please do consider reaching out to NextWave Partners. You can do that through their website at next-wavepartners.com, or you can reach out to one of their consultants directly through their LinkedIn, where you can find someone in your region and in your space that makes sense to connect with. Also worth mentioning, NextWave does talent retention services too. So, given the kind of mass shifting around of talent these days, it could be worth talking to NextWave for any talent retention purposes as well. But without any further delay, let's get into the show. All right, Zach, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm very, very excited for this conversation. I think this is going to be a bit different, kind of focused on the software side, generally speaking, of EV, but I'm excited. So why don't you, I guess, just give us kind of a quick introduction to who you are, first of all, and what you're doing.
Sure. I'm Zach Lefevre. I'm the founder and CEO of ChargeLabs. ChargeLabs is the operating system for EV charging. We don't build any EV charging hardware, but we build a software platform that sits on top of different brands of EV chargers. And once these EV chargers are connected to our software, we make them smarter and easier to use, more useful for fleets, multifamily buildings, public charging networks, and ultimately EV drivers who we want to provide a better charging service for.
Okay. How did you end up getting into this space?
Yeah. So my experience in the EV industry goes back to 2015. I had previously run some businesses that were moderately successful. I had studied computer science, so my background was in software. And I was just hanging around these groups in 2015. It was a really interesting time because the Tesla Model S had been released, but there was no Model 3, there was no Model X, and you had a handful of other electric vehicles, the Nissan Leaf, the BMW i3, but really not the selection that you have today. But what was so fascinating about EV drivers back then is they were having these meetups. And when you think about it, you don't have like a Honda Civic meetup where like a bunch of people who drive Honda Civics come out on the weekend to like compare notes, but you were having these Nissan Leaf meetups, you were having these EV meetups. And like many people at the time, I had thought, oh, EVs are this kind of like green alternative technology, but there's going to be some compromise over the status quo, right? Like the main benefit is that these vehicles are green. But what I found is that, there've been kind of a lot of marketing by the internal combustion engine industry to make you think these cars were deficient in some way. The first time you get into an electric car, whether it is the Tesla Model S in 2015 or even the Nissan Leaf, which had that older design that kind of looked like a weird alien spaceship, like the minute you step into it, you realize this Nissan Leaf accelerates like a BMW. It's super futuristic and like sounds completely silent. And once the cost of these vehicles come down, this is what everybody's going to prefer to drive. So back in 2015, I got a lot of conviction that everybody was going to drive electric vehicles in the future, either for carbon reduction and environmental reasons, or just because it's a better experience overall. Like I drive an electric vehicle and I have a full tank of gas every morning. People always say, well, there's not enough chargers, and that's the business we're in and what we're trying to solve. But me, I charge at home, and like, I don't have to go to gas stations, every week now. So, I got a lot of conviction about the future of EVs. And then I was just looking at, okay, what are the gaps going to be? And there were not a lot of good answers for the questions I had about charging infrastructure and EV chargers back then. So I started a business, and we started actually just reselling EV charging hardware before we wrote a single line of code. But from running that business, we found out what was missing in the software layer, which was namely that a lot of businesses wanted to monetize EV chargers or monitor them or do power management. And this didn't come out of the box with any of the EV chargers we were selling. So we built this hardware agnostic software platform that sits on top of EV chargers built by ABB and Siemens and Delta Electronics, Feihong, all these different manufacturers. And we built that in a direct response to what I was finding on the ground selling these devices.
Got it. So essentially born out of conviction that it was going to happen, and then finding the easiest point of entry, which was essentially reselling and creating a marketplace for it, and then filling in a gap. I'm kind of curious, what did it look like before this kind of software came, before you built ChargeLab? How did these other individual manufacturers manage it? How did it interface with other vehicles? I'm kind of curious to understand this idea of getting things to integrate when you have multiple options.
Yeah. So, for sure, Gen 1 EV charging solutions is just, plug in your car and get free energy. So EVs kind of came to the US North American market in 2011, 2012. And at that time, similar to today, most people just charged at home. Right. So you can actually literally just plug an EV into a 120 volt outlet, the same outlet that you charge your iPhone, your cell phone on, or your computer on. But if you want faster, better kind of speeds in charging, you get a level 2 charger, which plugs into a 240 volt outlet. So you can kind of think of 240 volts more as like a dryer or, a electric stove plug versus the 120 volt plugs that you get with, you plug your phones into. But kind of Gen 1 of level 2 chargers was just, we're just going to offer charging for free. In the early days, like when Tesla was kind of building out their network, they would just give free chargers to, luxury hotels. So the hotels would pay the cost to install these chargers. They would give out the electricity for free. But, you're making the money back on a hotel night stay. And that worked for the first, 5, 6, 7 years of EVs, because not a lot of people were driving EVs. But when you get to the point of, 5, 10, 15, 20 people plugging into a single office building or a single apartment building or multifamily building, all of a sudden that actually becomes a significant cost to the building of giving away this electricity for free. Mm-hmm. So at that point, the building is going to want to do, billing to recoup their energy cost. They're also going to want to, do power management, where every building in the world has a limited electrical capacity. I mean, when you think about it, it's very logical. If you're bringing water into a building, you don't bring in, if you only need that much water, you don't bring in a pipe like that. Electricity is just the same. There's limited electrical capacity coming into all of these buildings. And so what our software does is it takes the limited electrical capacity and it distributes it among however many EV chargers you want to install. So actually before ChargeLab, there were definitely connected smart EV charging solutions. But the most common alternative was, hey, we're a building, we're just going to put in 1 or 2 EV chargers, and we'll give the energy away for free, so that the guy who drives a Tesla will stop bugging us about, hey, can I charge my car here? But that is clearly not a sustainable solution. That was just an entry into the market, and so most of our customers, we're not replacing another smart charging software. We're putting in their first smart charging software, because for the first time, these buildings and fleet depots that we're going into have enough electric vehicles. They actually need our software.
Okay, interesting. So I guess there's a couple of things. You mentioned a lot of things. I maybe want to unpack. What do you see for the future of the industry? How it's going to look probably in the future for building owners, et cetera. And then I want to go into the financials of managing these at some point after this.
Yeah. So I think one idea that is out there in the ether and that I think is right is that parking is charging. So I think in the future, everywhere you can park a car, more or less, you will find charging infrastructure. I think EV chargers will be abundant. And I think it will be a much more of an optimization algorithm than a discovery algorithm, right? I think that kind of the ability to find EV chargers is not going to be that much of a problem in the future, because there's going to be EV chargers everywhere. However, paying the right price, charging at a time where it's easy on the grid, charging in a way that has the least impact on carbon output. Because as you know, the grid is very clean sometimes, and in some places very dirty at other times, and in other places. I think it's going to be much more of an optimization algorithm. So I think what we're going to see in the next 10 years of EV charging is EV chargers being deployed everywhere, but a lot more intelligence and software being layered on there to keep the cost down. Because right now, if I go to some DC fast charging stations in the US, I'm paying more than I would pay with gas, even at the outrageous prices that gas is now hitting. In other cases, I'm paying, 20% of what I would pay with gas. So you have this huge variability with depending on where you're charging, how fast you're charging. So I think there's going to be a lot more, kind of a lot of advancements in pricing and optimization. But yeah, I think the future is, you live at a single family home, you charge there, you go, you travel between cities, you stop at a convenience store, you do super fast charging there. Let's say you live in a multifamily building. Maybe there isn't charging available at your home. So you'll charge again at convenience stores, you'll charge at the grocery store, you'll charge at an office building. But I think overall, just to kind of like hammer that point home, we already know the ratio broadly of EV chargers to EVs. And there's going to be 1.1 EV chargers for every EV. So if there's, 100 million EVs in North America, there's going to be 110 million charging locations. So you're literally going to have more places to plug in than you will have EVs, which is really a shift from gasoline vehicles. I think I did the math, and I actually can't remember the figure now, but it's somewhere between like 80 and 200 vehicles per fuel pump. It's going to be a completely different dynamic where you're able to charge in many more places. But in order to get the speed or cost that you want, you're going to have to get more creative. Okay, got it. So this kind of, maybe before we go into the investment and how to monetize this, I'd be curious could you break down, if that's going to be the case, I would assume that maybe if the mentality is largely not around full charging every time, right? Like what I think oftentimes think of, we top our gas tank off, right? We're filling it all the way up. If that's going to be the mentality shift, that there's essentially more places to charge than vehicles, what are the types of chargers or the categories of chargers that we're going to be looking at? Because you mentioned, of course, like cross country travel, right? You're going to need fast chargers for that, but you can maybe do a little bit easier load if you're just parking on the street for 20 minutes to go grab a coffee or something, right? So could you maybe break that down and kind of how you see it dividing up in the future or currently? Yeah, so I think that right now you've got everything from plugging in, on a 120 volt outlet, which will give you about like 5 miles per hour of range, to a level 2 charger, which is the most common type of charger you use, which will give you about 25 miles of range. to these chargers that can literally give you at their peak power, like 1,000 miles of range. And there's no EVs that have 1,000-mile range. So that means you're filling up from 0 to 80% or 0 to 100% in less than an hour. Where I think that the charging speeds are going to go is you're going to have a ton of these level 2, 7 to 10 kilowatt chargers. Just absolutely everywhere. You're going to have them in single family homes, office buildings, multifamily fleets. And then on the DC fast charging side, you're going to go as fast as possible, because when you are there out in the public between cities, you're, at a rest stop, you're going to want to charge as fast as possible. So the kind of middle speeds you have, like the 50 kilowatt DC fast charging, that is largely going to disappear. And you're going to go towards, 7 to 10 kilowatt level 2 charging, and then 150 kilowatt plus, and potentially even like 250 kilowatt plus DC fast charging. So it's not all about going faster. It's about this bifurcation of like 7 to 10 kilowatts is more than enough for overnight charging, stay in the same place. That's 25 miles and in an hour of charging. Most people only drive about 30 miles a day. So it means you can fill up your car every day in less than an hour. You don't need to go any faster than that at home or at your office, or even arguably at a grocery store, right? You're going to spend an hour there. You could top up 25 miles pretty easy. But where we are going to go faster is this public infrastructure. And I think where you want to watch there is the NEVI funding, the infrastructure bill funding. And that is primarily targeting that corridor DC fast charging. And they're doing the right things in that bill of requiring, I believe it requires at least 150 kilowatt output per port. And they're requiring at least 4 ports per location. So that infrastructure bill over the next 5 years is essentially going to build out our public DC fast charging. But again, going back to those, 100 million vehicles will have 110 million chargers. Probably 100 million, like over 90% of those are going to be level 2 kind of mid-speed slow chargers. And then you're going to have, a certain percentage of those are going to be very, very fast DC fast chargers.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess it's very interesting to think about it this way, because we always complain about the range is a big issue, but I mean, the majority of people aren't going to be using it. Like my parents, if they had an EV, they'd almost never go over the range, right? And they typically go back and forth between 2 cities, right? So it's very, very basic. But okay, so let's move on to kind of how is it financially possible to operate these? Like, what are some of the different financial models for operating these chargers? I know I talked to somebody a while ago who mentioned he's in the development space for C&I projects for like solar and storage, right? And he mentioned that a lot of people assume these days that they're going to be getting the electricity for free for the vehicles, and that mindset shift will have to change. What do you see as far as the ways that is done now for kind of the return on investment and how it can be in the future, or what you see going towards?
Yeah, he's 100% right. I would say that the mindset has already changed. When we think of a lot of what people believe in an industry comes from the leaders in that industry. So why did people think that the electricity to charge their EVs was going to be free? It's because the Tesla supercharger network was free. You buy a Model S, you buy a Model X, you get free charge on the supercharger network for life. That is gone now. And that has been gone, that's been gone for 4 or 5 years. So every Model 3, EV that's purchased, you have to pay at the Tesla supercharger. So you go to the supercharging network and you pay, but people still go. And so if you look at kind of who created this idea of free charging, it was Tesla, and they moved off that model years ago. And so I think every time you're looking at a commercial building development, things like that, they want to at least recoup their cost, if not make a profit on EV charging. Now, I think it's important to think about, who is really recouping their costs versus who is making a profit. I think when you look at office buildings and multifamily buildings where there's going to be a lot of charging infrastructure, I don't think that these building owners should be thinking about making a profit, because if you're a condo developer, let's say, you used to build nice apartments or nice condos, you would sell them, you would make your profit. And then all those darn condo builders around you started offering in-unit washer and dryers, right? So now you got to add in-unit washer and dryers. And then everybody started offering pools. Now you have to build a pool. And if you look at like as a condo board or a strata, pools cost money to put in, they cost money to maintain, but you're going to do it because it's part of this broader lifestyle package of living in a nice condo building. And it either gets baked into the cost of the unit or whatever. So I think EV charging is very similar. Like to think, multifamily buildings will only put in EV chargers if they can make money. It's like, no, they'll put them in so they can rent out units. Right? Like trying to make a couple cents per kilowatt hour versus renting out a $2,000 per month apartment. These guys want to have as many of these units rented out as possible. And so EV charging is a path for doing that. So I think there's going to be a lot of cases where EV charging is just break even. It's just an amenity. Again, if you're a Walmart, you don't want to get into the fuel business. You're not trying to, compete and make money selling fuel. But if you can put in EV chargers to get people into the door to purchase, products, then you'll do that. Now, if you are a public charging network or you are a convenience store and your business is based around, selling fuel, there will be ways to make money. There's a couple of things you have to look at. The first is just, cost versus what you bill. And so there's a lot of things you can do to optimize on cost. You can install battery systems at your site so that you're pulling energy from the grid when it's cheaper and then selling it, at a markup. And so I think that a lot of these businesses are going to get really smart about microgrids really quickly, where there's an arbitrage opportunity, especially in where utilities have peak demand. They have demand charges and peak energy costs, which I'm happy to dive into in more detail, either one of those, both demand charges and peak energy costs. And then the other thing that I think most people are not appreciating is things like carbon offsets and carbon credits. So, one thing that we help our customers with at ChargeLab in California is the low carbon fuel standard program. So it's actually a very lucrative program for people installing and operating public EV chargers. And so, there's multiple streams of income, whether it's people coming into your store to shop, whether it's just selling the electrons that you're buying for a cheaper price from the grid, or whether it's claiming these carbon credits that are traded on kind of like an open carbon market. I think these are the things that factor into the business model of EV charging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. Again, one thought I'd have is that if there's a lot of chargers everywhere that can kind of handle the majority of your needs, right? And like you said, a lot of these places, they're going to use it as an attraction tool for customers potentially. Then it wouldn't be as much that most companies wouldn't focus on like, hey, we need to make sure we're getting return on this. It would just be like, hey, this is a in order to attract more, have a competitive advantage, right? We want to have this, right? So I think that'd be interesting to see how that folds out. I am keen to understand maybe we could talk about this next. For example, the between cities type of convenience stores, right? Where people would typically fuel and they need to make a profit, of course, on that typically. What does it look like for them, do you know, or can you speak much to the extra things that they might have to invest in with, maybe additional, I don't know how they have to upgrade their transmission grid to be able to get more power there, because depending on how large you go, I'm assuming there could be a decent demand increase. So could you maybe talk about that process and what you see there?
Yeah, so there's a couple of problems with corridor charging. One is what you hit on, which is capacity. I mean, talking about that pipe problem, like when this gas station was built, if they thought they only needed this much electricity, they brought in this much electricity. Now they need this much electricity to power the EVs. So there's not enough power. So either they're going to have to upgrade their infrastructure. And that's a big part of what the NEVI funding will help with is bringing in a bigger service from the utility. But that's not always going to be possible. And the reason for that is because the grid is constrained in certain areas. And so in those areas, you're going to want to look at battery boosted EV charging solutions. So there's companies, there's several companies working on this. We work with one called Intertie. There's another called FreeWire that builds a battery boosted DC fast charger. And what's really attractive about these battery boosted DC fast chargers is you could pull, let's say 20, 30 kilowatts from the grid at a constant rate, charge up this 100 or 150 kilowatt hour battery, and then discharge at a rate of 150 or 200 kilowatts. So that solves a lot of the infrastructure problem. But then speaking of the battery boosted, the other thing that handles is demand charges. And so demand charges are something that aren't most people don't know about them because they're more for commercial electricity consumption, right? When you buy electricity at your apartment, condo, single family home, you pay a rate. For me, I pay like 12 cents per kilowatt hour. Some people in California are paying 19, 20 cents per kilowatt hour. Other states have like 5 cents per kilowatt hour on the low end. But you're just paying for the amount of energy you use. Mm-hmm. But in many, many jurisdictions, not only are you paying for the amount of energy you use, you're paying for the peak demand that you put on the grid. Meaning that if my factory peaks at 1.2 megawatts versus 1.9 megawatts, I'm going to pay fewer demand charges. Mm-hmm. And what's so interesting about demand charges is EV charging is totally a peaking activity, right? When you pull up to a quarter charger along the highway, you want to pull as much power as you can. So you have these C-stores that were previously peaking at, 100, 200 kilowatts. You put in 150 kilowatt DC fast chargers, now they're going to be peaking at 800 kilowatts. So it's just a massive jump. And that's very, very costly if you don't have a sufficiently high utilization. If you have a high utilization of your EV chargers, you can kind of spread out that demand charge across all of the different, kilowatt hours you're selling. But the problem with demand charges is if you're billed a premium based on the 15-minute peak over a month. So if you hit 800 kilowatts once in that month, you're billed this big demand charge. So the battery boosted charger becomes very attractive in those cases as well. So, it sounds kind of crazy because what you're doing with EV charging is charging a battery that's in the car. But actually, because of the way the grid's set up and the cost profiles of all this stuff, you may want to be charging a battery at your convenience store and then discharging that into the car versus charging directly from the grid. From our end, from our business, like this is where you start to see kind of software playing a really big role in EV charging, because we can optimize things like, how much power a charger is outputting. If it's not very common for all 4 of these chargers to be used at once, we can optimize that. And when 4 people do plug in, we can turn everybody down a little bit just to kind of curb those peak demand charges. And then we can, of course, interface with the batteries to make sure that like these EV charging systems are running optimally.
Mm-hmm. Do you guys have an AI component that kind of helps to identify these things over the course of time and use?
Yeah. So I think, AI is like ultimately going to be synonymous with software. And so the other thing about AI is it takes a tremendous amount of data for most kind of machine learning models. So a lot of the optimization we're doing today is at a local kind of site level. But we're certainly looking at like predictive models for demand and supply. The other thing we are using artificial intelligence for is monitoring equipment, right? So we have thousands of these EV charging devices connected, and we're trying to predict when they will go offline or when they will fault in different ways. So for us, I think there's a long-term opportunity to use AI on demand response and managing the impact of EV charge on the grid. But there's also many short-term optimizations like predicting when equipment will fail, when it'll have issues and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. What about, I guess this idea, we have to have a mindset shift, as you mentioned in the beginning. Do you think that the idea and kind of the mentality behind vehicle ownership in general will shift over the coming years? I think there's some companies working on like being able to have short-term leases of vehicles for 2 to 3 months, things like that. Because, if we look at it, the majority of people, like you said, drive about 30 miles, less than 30 miles in a day. And when you do take those cross-country trips, or whatever for vacations, what it might be, it's going to be a different scenario. Do you see shifting behaviors in that, or kind of what are you thinking might happen in the future with this whole mentality of owning vehicles?
Yeah. Great question. I think one of the most interesting models I've seen of this so far is there's a couple folks who are doing, they're going into multifamily buildings and providing 2, 3, 4 electric vehicles that can be rented on a daily or hourly basis. And that makes a ton of sense to me because when I lived in a apartment building downtown, I had a car, I paid hundreds of dollars per month for a parking space, and I use my car like twice a month. And so the idea of an electric car, sitting in the basement of my apartment building, charging up, and I can grab it and go to the store when I need and then bring it back. I think shared mobility like that makes a ton of sense. I think Uber, Lyft, and other rideshare alternatives also make a ton of sense. Then on the flip side of that, I've now, during the pandemic, I moved to the suburbs. I now live at a single family home in the suburbs. And, without my own personal car that I own, I'm kind of stuck. Rideshare services will get here. But, my grocery store is a 5-minute drive down the road. It's too far to walk. But I also don't want to call an Uber, and there's not really kind of a shared mobility solution for that yet. So I think that the future of mobility and energy is fascinating and it's going to change a lot. But I think it's also important to remember that the vast majority of Americans, Canadians, people in North America still live in single family homes. And so I think we will see reallocation of mobility resources and parking and things like that in downtown cores relatively quickly. But then I think vehicle ownership is gonna persist in more suburban areas and certainly rural areas for a long time. I also think that autonomous vehicles are starting to feel like the way of the future, and they'll always be that. Meaning that we thought, 5 years ago, there were certain, very well respected people who were very bullish on like fully autonomous, everybody being fully autonomous by 2022. I think we will reach full autonomy eventually, but I think there's a lot of kind of middle ground to fill in. And so in our business, like we certainly think about, how can we provide the best charging services to rideshare and these rentals and condos and things like that. But also, how can we accommodate the fact that there are, tens of millions of single family homes that will need EV chargers, that will continue to have private vehicle ownership. So I think it's, for me, like, as generic as it sounds, it's all of the above. We're going to have better, micro mobility and shared mobility solutions, and then vehicle ownership is also going to persist. But I think the trend that will go across it all is like EVs are here and electric vehicles are here to stay. All of like you already, like every Uber or Lyft you get into is like a Prius, because it's just more affordable to drive a hybrid vehicle if you're driving a lot. I think you'll see a huge shift to electric vehicles on the ride sharing platforms. With vehicles like the Ford F-150 Lightning, you're going to see a huge shift of vehicles that are owned and fleet vehicles going electric. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see if we have this conversation 5 years from now. I mean, I'm curious of the people that come on your podcast, how many of them own a vehicle? I own one car now. I'm sure some people own 2 or 3 cars, and I'm sure a lot of people own 0 cars. So we'll see how that shifts over time.
Yeah, I just find it fascinating because I moved from rural Wisconsin to New York City, right, where I sold my car when I moved. And then after going back and visiting, oftentimes because of the pandemic, I had more flexibility to visit. I ended up buying a car that I keep in Wisconsin now, right? So I let my family drive it. But I just find it fascinating to see kind of what the future will be, because I think the dilemma is people are often thinking about that occasional long trip, right? And EVs can definitely solve the short trips, but also I think there's this mentality. It's difficult, especially in the West, kind of with this homestead kind of independence mentality, that that's my independence, right? That's what America, I'm not super well versed in Canada, but that's what America was built on. Like this, the car manufacturers, like this is mine, and that's how I get around, essentially, right? From horses to cars, right? So I just find it difficult to believe that that will change quickly, because there's a lot of people in this country that are still like very set on that mentality, maybe in the coming generations, but I am interested to see how it works out. Kind of on the same token, what do you see? Maybe you have examples of cities doing this, or municipalities, with kind of just the other types of mobility, e-mobility, generally speaking, within cities, and then how that might relate to the same charging infrastructure for those. Again, typically, I have an electric skateboard to get around New York City whenever I, go across town. But I'm just kind of curious to like hear what your thoughts are generally and how that might look in the future.
Yeah. I just got home. I was at South by Southwest this week in Austin, and man, I've been to San Francisco a bunch of times, and with all the scooters, but I have never seen as many scooters and and e-bikes, seriously all over downtown. So clearly, between Bird, Lime, all the other players, you've got these electric micromobility, and you've got it here to stay. And I believe that the model they have is they're having, they might have some level of depot charging where they're driving trucks around, picking these up, charging them up. But I believe they also have individuals, taking these vehicles home and charging them and putting them back on the street. And, that becomes another kind of source of income or part of the gig economy. So yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I used the little scooters to zip around Austin while I was there, and it was great. I think that there will be some crossover with like EV infrastructure being put into big parking lots, and then also putting like scooter charging or bike charging side by side. But just, candidly, my experience is typically the people who are looking at EV charging are looking at it through like they're focused on heavy duty, or they're focused on vehicles. When I say heavy duty, I mean like a car versus a scooter, but then also heavy duty vehicles like buses, trucks, stuff like that. So, we do a lot of fleet charging. That's a big recent focus of ours. And in those cases, we're just looking at how can we charge the vehicles. But I think that, anything that reduces congestion downtown is great, because what's happening with rideshare and autonomous vehicles is not that people are driving less, people are driving more. And it's great, right? Now that you have rideshare companies, you have people who were not previously able to drive a car. So think of, teenagers, elderly, people with disabilities who can now move around and get around. But I think that increasing access to mobility is also going to increase traffic and congestion and all of these problems. So if you can alleviate it with micromobility, that's great. And I think the other takeaway here is it's just like, when we think about, are vehicles going to be gasoline powered in the future or electric? Like, you can look at all of these micromobility things, and like, these are all e-bikes, they're all e-scooters. That's for a reason. Like, electric vehicles fundamentally make a lot more sense. If you had a little gas tank in your Lime scooter and you had to fill it up and like turn over the engine and make sure everything was working correctly, it would be a lot more difficult. So I think that, I think that just gives you a hint at kind of like what the future of mobility is overall in terms of like shifting towards electric vehicles.
Yeah, I find it fascinating, because it's also very difficult to kind of get some sort of uniformity where you can essentially like make sure that, generally speaking, that the streets are still going to function properly and everything like that, because it becomes a bit of a chaos, right? There's a few, major players, and I see all these people zipping around New York City and their different versions. So it's always it's a bit of chaos, but to be honest. But okay, let's just see how should we end this. I think maybe I'd be keen to hear, on the regulatory side of things, what are some things that you see being done? Obviously, there's kind of something about the infrastructure bill we've talked about, but generally speaking, what do you think the role of regulation is going to be, or should be, in helping to shift to this more EV space and helping to basically get the infrastructure in place to do these things? And are there any specific things coming down the pipe that you're looking at and noticing?
Well, I think there's the ideal, and then there's what we're going to get. I mean, the ideal is regulation getting out of the way. I think generally markets are very efficient and solve a lot of the problems themselves. However, I think we absolutely need EV rebates and EV charging rebates, not because I'm pro regulation, but because fossil fuels have been subsidized for so long. People who come after, oh my God, why are we spending billions of dollars on EV chargers and EV subsidies? And yeah, there are problems with these programs. You're subsidizing people who can already afford to buy an electric vehicle, things like that. But there have been hundreds of billions of dollars in fossil fuel subsidies given out in the United States, over the past century. And so in many ways, like, I think you could argue that the switch to electric vehicles was delayed by subsidization of fossil fuel industries, right? So if I could wave a wand and have all subsidization of fossil fuels, gasoline vehicles, and electric vehicles stop, I would, because I think EVs are fundamentally a superior technology. Electricity is cheaper than oil. It's made in America versus imported, right? When you fill up your EV, you're using power that is made in America versus imported oil. And so I think, subsidies and regulations aside, EVs would win hands down. And with the demand that we're seeing for EVs, the cost is going to get pushed down. Battery manufacturing costs are going to go down. EVs are going to be cost competitive with internal combustion engine vehicles. Basically, they already are on a total cost of ownership. So if you take like a 15-year period purchasing and operating the vehicle, the more lower cost EVs are already more affordable than the lower cost gasoline vehicles. But I think that trend is only going to continue. I think, in a couple of years, like, my thesis has always been that you will have the early adopters who want the cool technology or are very conscious about the environment. But when EV adoption will really take off is when it costs less to drive an EV or to buy an EV and drive an EV than a gasoline vehicle, because that's how, to your point, that's how America works, right? It's a marketplace, and the best ideas and the best products win. EVs are a better idea and are a better product than internal combustion engine vehicals, right? Like a Honda Civic has 2,500 moving parts. A Tesla Model 3 has like 18 moving parts. I'm not a mechanical engineer, but you can kind of do the math on what's going to be maintained, what's going to be easier to maintain, and what's going to cause you more problems. I'm not saying that Teslas never break down. Everything with moving parts breaks down. Everything with software breaks down. Entropy happens. But yeah, I mean, I was even like on Twitter the other day, like someone was like, people are always hassling me. They're like, well, what about all the fires that happen with electric vehicles? And I finally looked up the stats. For every 100,000 vehicles sold with gasoline internal combustion engine vehicles, there's 1,530 fires. So 1,530 fires per 100,000 gas vehicles sold. With electric vehicles, it's 25.
Wow, that's actually very interesting. I gotta clip that.
So EVs are the new technology. People are more afraid. When an EV catches on fire, it's going to make the news. Just like when an autonomous vehicle gets in an accident and someone gets hurt, it's going to make the news. But if you or I go and get on a car and go get in a car accident, we're not going to be on the news. I'm sorry. We're not that cool. If we were in an autonomous vehicle, that could make the news. But it's very much the same thing where people are afraid of what's new and what's unknown. But EVs are actually much safer, much cheaper to own and operate. And so, I mean, coming back to the question of regulation, like, yeah, if I could wave around a wand and get rid of all regulation, I would, because EVs would win. But to the extent that we're going to continue subsidizing oil and gas industry, we're going to continue subsidizing car manufacturers that are making gasoline vehicles. It's important that we at least match that in terms of subsidies and regulations to promote EV infrastructure and EVs.
Yeah, that seems fair. What you mentioned a couple of times, I think we should maybe talk about this too, is the energy independence kind of idea, right? this is obviously something I'm super fascinated by as the United States in general and just North America. But could you talk about the benefit of having and using EVs kind of on a broader scale, even for other countries, like for smaller countries, and how important this could be for them?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think what you know, we're you and I, we were talking earlier, we kind of beat around the bush, but like the direct thing is like uh the politics in America are very polarized. You have Democrats and you have Republicans, right? And for some reason, EVs are viewed as a Democrat idea because
Yeah.
they are clean, they are good for the environment, they help solve climate change. I think that EVs should equally be a Republican idea because they create energy independence for the United States. Like this has never been more clear than the past 3 weeks, right? The price of oil, what's going on with Russia, it's horrible. But the main thing that's been highlighted back home is that in the United States, we are not energy independent, right? We rely on a global supply chain to get our energy. If you switch to EVs, you generate electricity from, sun, wind, rivers, even natural gas power plants in the US, and you control your own destiny, right? Like you can move around goods and people and services without relying on a foreign power to import oil. So I think, for that reason, I think Republicans are both a Democrat or I think EVs are both a Democrat and a Republican idea. And then the other thing that I think people fail to realize, again, climate change is incredibly important, but putting it aside for a minute, like I never really enjoyed standing in the wrong place when, my brother or my parents turned on the car and I happened to be standing at the back of the car and I got this big puff of exhaust up in my face. Like that's not healthy. Like there's correlations. Like if you live close to a highway, you're significantly more likely to have Alzheimer's, dementia, lung cancer. There's real health issues that come with gasoline vehicles. And again, this is not a Democrat or Republican idea. Everybody likes going to the country and smelling the fresh air and saying, like, what a beautiful hike, what a beautiful forest. If everybody drove EVs, cities would be a lot less noisy. They would smell a lot cleaner. And I think that's something that like is a bipartisan issue that we can all get behind. And certainly like that's, I'm behind that idea.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of different ways to look at it, right? I think it's just that it tends to be probably from the adoption curve that most people are thinking, hey, this is new, so therefore it's worse, right? They're so apprehensive of it, right? But they're doing something now, they're using something now that at one point was, an improvement from horse and buggy, right? Like Elon Musk always says. So okay, maybe just a last final thing. Generally speaking, on the education and kind of training front, how do you see universities doing a good job or maybe not to help get the pipeline of talent into this space? I feel like EVs get a lot of kind of press rate because of Tesla and other things, but climate tech doesn't as a whole as much. But what do you see that's being done? Do you think there needs to be more work done? Maybe different models for the university, right? Maybe people don't go to university because they can get good paying jobs with tech programs or whatever. I just want to curious to hear your thoughts, generally speaking, on this space and how the education space is going to help it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are to a certain extent in an education bubble where the cost of education, especially in the US, versus the value you get from it, it's been inflated and inflated and inflated. So I think folks going into trades. Okay, one thing I'll say that's directly related to my business and EV infrastructure is the most expensive part of putting EV chargers in the ground is the technical capabilities and the labor. So electricians and electrical engineers, right? So as we, over the coming decades, build out EV chargers and solar panels and install batteries, you're going to need a ton more skilled trades. So, like, I think there's a very good chance you will make more money over your career if you decide to become an electrician today than you go into kind of some of the less lucrative university tracks, right? Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's a ton of opportunities for skilled trades, and we need to encourage more people to go into them. I also think there's an education bubble overall, and people are going to find new ways to learning online, learning from each other, joining startups like ChargeLab, and like learning on the job. So I think, that's this is a subject for a whole other podcast, but education is totally going to be disrupted. But at the same time, like when we talk about disruption, it comes back to us talking about, okay, are people going to own vehicles or not? It's like universities are big and powerful enough that they will be around for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a yes, universities will continue. And there'll be all these other options for education. But I mean, specifically, there's like really interesting work that being done at universities developing new batteries that can be used in EVs. There's a ton of, ton of that battery research. We work with a number of different institutions actually on their kind of like smart grid and, electric vehicle programs. So, I would say if you're going into first year of college and you're interested in this stuff, like find out if there's a EV or EV infrastructure program at your school. And if not, ask the engineering department to create it. Because, a lot of the best schools are already kind of investing in these types of things.
Yeah, I find that interesting. I think there's a lot of topics. I'm very passionate about the education space and how it will change. I'm a, never went to university and kind of alternative path too. So it's very interesting to me, but I also find it interesting that there's such a demand for these jobs, and it doesn't take a genius to do these jobs, and they're good paying jobs, right? So I don't see why people want them to have four-year degrees, right, for all these things, when really larger companies who can afford it should be training people, right? They're going to get their talent for less. They're going to have more loyal talent if they build a good company. And I think that the long-term benefits will be actually very positive, but there's a lot of trade-offs, right? Obviously you mentioned that's something I hadn't thought about before, is the university, like R&D funding. But anyways,
I mean, what I would say is, like, we are a software company. We work with EV chargers, we work with EVs, we touch lots of hardware on the ground, but we build the software that sits behind all of that and powers these devices, powers these networks. And when we look to hire software developers, we look for people with computer science or software engineering degrees, but we also look at people who have done coding boot camps, people who never went to college, but went to learn how to code. And basically, to get a job at ChargeLab, you don't have to have a university degree as an engineer. You have to complete a coding challenge. So if you can complete our challenge, and you could do it better than those, guys with the fancy hats that went to college, we will hire you in a heartbeat. And I think a lot of companies, maybe not the bigger companies, but a lot of smaller companies, have the same opinion. Like, I would tell you, among the startup founders that I know, there's not, like, I would say there's almost an overwhelming consensus that university degree doesn't matter. What matters is your skills and your attitude. Are you able to do the job that we need done? And are you willing to learn? Are you willing to work hard? Are you willing to take the risk of being a part of a startup where it's not a guaranteed thing? We don't pay as high as Google and Apple, but we offer a chance to really influence directly the things that you work on. So, I mean, specifically, like, you talk to people in all different domains. In our domain of software, like, if there's anyone listening to this who does not have a technical skill set, does not have a technical degree, but thinks that you could do something technical, go look at a coding boot camp. Like, you can learn how to code. It's not easy. Nothing's easy. But it doesn't take years. It can be done in months. And there's a huge shortage of electricians. There's a huge shortage of software developers. So become a good developer, learn how to code, and come take our coding challenge.
Very good. Well, this has been a really, really great conversation. Really glad you came on. I'm definitely excited to see what continues to happen in the future, but we'll definitely have to have you back on.
Awesome. Really appreciate it. And really big fan of all the interviews you're doing on this podcast.
Yeah, thanks, man. Really appreciate it.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining on today's episode. Really hope you enjoyed the conversation with Zach as much as I did. If you would like to continue hearing more conversations like this, please do subscribe and turn on the notifications on the respective applications that you're listening on. We do ask specifically, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, as always, please do give us a rating and a review so we can help to gain greater reach. It really does help spread the podcast. Obviously, this entire show, all we're doing here is trying to spread the word about what's happening. So we really want to, help get the word out. So that would be much appreciated. Please do share this episode with somebody who might find it interesting. I feel like there's a lot of different people who could benefit from some of the aspects of this show. Perhaps share the clips or the areas that kind of most resonate with you or potentially with your friends. If you're interested, you can get more involved by joining the Slack channel, which is the link for it is in the description. If you want to get more involved with other professionals in the space or just network in general, sometimes some interesting things are happening there. And then, of course, please do connect with Zach on LinkedIn and look into ChargeLab, look into their website. And, of course, as always, feel free to reach me on Twitter with any questions you have. If you'd like to be on the podcast, somebody who I should interview, feel free to ping me there. And just a quick shout out for our next episode. We will have a discussion with Michael Luciani of Exponential Impact, which is a rolling syndicate fund where we discuss kind of climate tech investing at large. We did go into some interesting topics. I think it was one that covered a lot of, I guess you could say, pertinent kind of topics right now. We went on just investing in general all the way over to kind of how will blockchain technologies play a role in the climate tech investing space. So very interesting conversation coming up next. So please stay tuned for that. And until then, thank you so much for listening to Clean Techies, the podcast.